Hi, you're watching Bread and Roses, a weekly political social television magazine on New Channel TV. I'm Maryam Namazie, and I'm presenting this week's program with my fantastic co-host, Fariborz Pooya.
Hello.
We're sorry to say that our lovely co-host, Bahram Surush, will no longer be with us in this program, but we will drag him to do some interviews so that we won't get to miss him
I don't
very
think I
much.
can perform anymore without Bahram. I don't know how we're going to carry on.
I know, Bahram, it's tough, but you know the saying, the show must go on. So we're going to carry on without you, but we'll miss you. In this week's program, we're going to be speaking about how science and the truth and evidence-based information is often lost in all this background noise and fluff and nonsense, superstition, religious nonsense, and so on and so forth. And how this has an effect not just on scientific evidence and learning, but on other aspects of our lives as well. We have a really interesting interview with PZ Meyers, the scientist, who talks about this background fluff and nonsense, as he calls it. And of course, we'll have the insane fatwa of the week. Difficult to choose given the fact that there are so many out there. You know, the thing that PZ Meyers talks about is not so much that people don't have a right to say what they want and to believe what they want, but the fact that not all beliefs and opinions are equal or equally valid. Let's go now, though, to a background clip on this issue, just so you know a little bit more about what we're going to be focusing on in this program, and then we'll be coming back to discuss it further. Stay with us. Scientific evidence is generally seen as the standard for good information, but we're faced with the appropriation of the mantle of science by charlatans and apologists for nonsense, according to the scientist PZ Meyers. Our appreciation of good information is being undermined by the 24/7 news cycle, by promotion of fluff and sensationalism, and by marginal cranks whose sense of entitlement allows them to demand greater representation in the name of tolerance. I mean, I think the thing that is quite obvious, and I think everybody who's listening to this program will have seen many examples of this, where you've got factual scientific evidence on the one hand and nonsense on the other, and oftentimes the nonsense is so loud, or it's often given so much airtime as if it's equivalent to the evidence-based scientific knowledge that's being discussed. For example, with regards creationism versus evolution. You know, there's scientific evidence on the theory of evolution. Nonetheless, you've got, you know, all these people talking about how the earth was created in a specific number of days by God, and how oftentimes you see in schools and in the media that the creationists, who are really crazy, insane people,
and I think partly
getting airtime.
I agree. I think partly is that public institutions allow this. And it's not only in the scientific sort of field or study or research, universities, that we see this phenomena of fluff.
That's a good term.
Yeah, absolutely, and background noise that enters serious institution and public space. It's in social sphere. We'll see that there has been a drive to undermine various established facts, established rights. Been undermined, and I think there's these combination of, you see, parallel in the social sphere as well.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's also, I mean, interests at play here, where keeping people superstitious and keeping them religious in a way is a very good means of control in a lot of ways.
And I agree, and I think that's undermining the basic rights is one of those major social issues that we've seen in the last 30 to 40 years, that we've established rights, established achievements, established standards, now that have been eroded. And I think there is a golden thread that links all of these issues together, and that's something we need to explore and discuss, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just in science. For example, well, I gave the example of creationism versus evolution, but there was also climate change is another big thing. You know, you've got this the most comprehensive report ever on climate change with evidence, and the BBC was criticized for allowing very much equal playtime to climate skeptics that have no evidence, and a lot of their findings are based on nonsense.
And they're all politically driven. And the climate skeptics, as you say, there are most of the opposition to the established facts, evolution, science, social standards, they're actually politically driven. What is it that undermines these? What interest exists that funds, supports, gives airtime, gives capacity, media time, institutions, all of these, that actually allows these people to come forward and occupy the public space and influence public policy and public institution. I mean, that's quite important. I think that's something we need to have a look at in a minute.
Well, let's go and look at this very interesting interview with the scientist PZ Meyers. We caught up with him at the recent World Humanist Congress, and we managed to talk to him a little bit about this. This was one of the issues he was discussing at the Congress there. Let's hear what he has to say, and we'll be back to discuss the issue further. Stay with us. PZ Meyers, thank you so much for coming on our program.
My pleasure.
I wanted to ask you first about what were your contributions at the World Humanist Congress this weekend?
So I gave a talk on how our discourse can be kind of poisoned by noise, that if we're too open to free speech, not to say that free speech is bad, but an excess of speech without any kind of brakes on it can be just as distracting, just as destructive as no speech at all. And in particular, I suggest that we humanists ought to be standing up for some principles. And there are certain things where you can talk about having a discussion, you can have a free speech discussion about something, but when somebody says something like, maybe we should debate whether women should have full rights. And I think the only answer we can give is no. We're done. Should we kill people who rob or steal or are atheist? And I think the answer's got to be no. No further discussion is required. As long as we have a strong set of principles behind our beliefs, I think a lot of these discussions are redundant. What they're actually doing is using them to serve a propaganda purpose and get us to stand up there and treat seriously what we should be dismissing as intolerant nonsense.
I mean, when you talk about this, it reminds me of how so many of the Islamists have been given opportunities to debate with atheists, where in fact they're pro-beheading of apostates and
Yes.
for the denial of rights to women.
Yeah, and there's nothing to debate there. I mean, it sounds kind of intolerant to say that these are things that we should not discuss, except that what these things are asking us to discuss is the abridgment of rights of human beings to exist. And I think that question's been settled. We all do.
And in a sense, oftentimes you find when there are these sort of debates, especially with movements that are fascist really, it's sort of normalizing their fascism and making it something that's worthy of debate.
Right. Yeah, this is something we've gone over in, I teach biology, I talk about evolution, and I oppose creationism. It's something we've gone over there over and over again, that creationists, for instance, would love to get me to stand up in a debate with them. And why? It's not as if they're going to convince me, and I know I'm not going to convince them, but what it does is it gives them credibility. It says, we are on a parity with scientists, so we can do this. And I imagine that, a lot of tyrants would love to get up there and discuss this with human rights activists, because then they can say, well, we're talking about human rights, right? So what if my position on human rights is that you don't get any?
I mean, it's interesting because this is something that for people in Iran is quite something that they know quite well, is the fact that the Iranian regime often wants to try to stop the teaching of evolution, and and even in the West you find sometimes the efforts to keep creationism on par with evolution. Why is it not, in your opinion?
Oh, well, as I mentioned earlier, there's some things that do not brook discussion anymore. There is no evidence for creationism. There is no science there. So if you're trying to argue for it as science, that was settled. That was settled 200 years ago, and there's no point in discussing it further. And it's not as if they've come up with new evidence or new ideas. They haven't. So what do? Do we keep going around and round in circles, talking about the same stuff? Or do we draw a line and say, no, unless you can come up with something novel, unless you've got some good evidence, this has been settled. The Earth is round, it's not flat. It's 4.5 billion years old, it's not 6,000 years old. All of these are facts that have been determined.
So what are the facts that support evolution?
Oh, there's so many.
Give us a couple.
Yeah. You know, when I am asked what I consider the primary evidence for evolution, the number one answer in my head is the molecular biology. That when you can sequence a genome, sequence a human genome, and you sequence a chimpanzee genome, and you find that they're nearly identical. And it's not just identity in the functional parts. You know, you could argue, oh, well, it's because they've got 2 arms and 2 legs, just like us, so the codes, no. It's even in the junk, even in the debris in the genome. And the only reason it is there is because it was passed on through ancestry. And further, we can analyze it deeper. We can go back to mice, we can go back to fish, we can go to insects even, and we find these similar genes doing similar jobs all over the place. And once again, I'll insist, it's not simply a functional constraint. It's a constraint of ancestry. And that's really persuasive to me. When I can piece together the genealogy of a whole group of organisms by doing a molecular analysis. You know, it's like most of us are comfortable with doing genealogy on our ancestors, right? You go and you look for the commonalities, you work this out. We can do paternity tests with genes and things like this. We can do exactly the same thing and ask what's the degree of relatedness between a human and a mouse. And it's there. We are related.
And why is it so important not to teach creationism in science? Why is it so important to keep teaching evolution? I know you mentioned the fact that, well, there's evidence for it, there's none for creationism. But in a sense, there are all these arguments in defense of, you know, this sort of equality of ideas and, well, you know, giving equal play to various ideas.
You know, the example I like to give is that, you know, when you take chemistry, you'll get a little bit of the history of chemistry. And for instance, I'll talk about the phlogiston theory, which is what we thought before people realized that there's oxidation going on. And it's presented as a historical example of how we fumbled our way towards the true answer. And so, you know, I kind of feel like creationism should be taught the same way, that, yeah, it's got some historical value. It's a really interesting idea that people came up with hundreds of years ago. And it's useful to study the history of ideas and see, here's how this original idea came along, here's how it transformed over time. You know, modern creationism is nothing like creationism about 100 years ago. Here's the evidence that shows a better way of thinking about it. In my own classes, for instance, one of the things I like to do is I have the students read some of Paley's stuff from 1803, you know, his natural theology. And then I give them Darwin's book. It's just a segment of Darwin's book. And what isn't really known is, a lot of people don't know, is a big chunk of Darwin's book was written specifically as a reply to Paley. And you can actually compare them side by side, where Darwin is giving the natural evidence, Paley is giving the theological evidence, and you can see for yourself how persuasive Darwin was.
Sometimes you hear about how religion has a positive role on science. I just heard it today about how, you know, Islam has such a wonderful effect on science. And I think science was despite Islam that it did have any positive effect. Do you think there's any positive role that religion has played in science?
No. Short
answer.
Right. Well, it's true that the Islamic world was a major leader in science, you know, in the Middle Ages. But it wasn't because of religion, it was because they preserved the texts, the Greek texts, the scientific texts from the past, and they took them seriously, while the West was busy replacing them with the Bible and theological texts. And that's something you got to give them props for, that they recognize that this is material of value. And it's when they started abandoning the science and going to the religion that you saw the decline in quality of Islamic science. And it's really a misnomer to call it Islamic science. It is the science of the people of Islam. It was not contributed to by Islam. It was contributed to by examining the natural world. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be science.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi everyone, I'm Maryam Namazie, and I wanted to tell you about a conference that I'm really excited about. It's being held during the 11th to 12th of October this year at a lovely hotel in London. It's an international conference on the religious rights, secularism and civil rights. And there are over 50 beautiful, wonderful speakers, people who've been on the front lines of battling the religious right and defending secularism, defending universal values. It's a conference that you can't miss, and it's not just going to be, debating and discussing all day. There's going to be loads of fun things to do as well. There'll be music and comedy and dance, and you're going to be meeting people who you will have never heard speak before, because many of them will be speaking for the first time in Britain and in the West. And they're people that you need to hear, because really they are, the conscience of many, many of us who are not happy with the state of the world, who want to see change, but want to see positive change that is good for everyone. So be there. I've been to a million conferences. I'm sure you have too, but I promise you this is going to be a conference that will be historic. And at the end of it, you and I can say that we were both there. So don't miss it. Don't miss it. I hope you enjoyed that interview with PZ Meyers. I mean, I think one of the important issues he raises is this whole idea that, this fluff and nonsense and this background noise is often given equal airtime as, out of respect and tolerance of other opinions. And what he says is, well, it's already been established. The earth is not flat, finished, goodbye. It reminds me of this BBC program I was invited to speak on, and the title of the program was "Should Stoning Be Condemned?" And again, this goes back to the thing that it's not just about science, it has an effect on every other aspect of our lives. And that very title, "Should Stoning Be Condemned?" it should be a given that, of course, it should be condemned. It shouldn't be even debated. It's not open to debate.
I think, should the slavery be condemned? Were we right to abolish slavery? What about segregation of men and women?
You should have respected the right of the slave owner.
Or some slaves wanted to be slaves. I mean, that's what there are always. There are some people who enjoy, wearing niqab. People you could find some children who love being punished. So I think that's a question. I think the driving force behind these challenges that we face, I think is right to say, actually, we don't want to discuss established facts with people who have from a margin to demand the rights.
I don't say established rights.
And established rights. But there is limit, because they're not just matter of equal importance, of course, but the force onto us. There are forces in operation that they try to fund and bring it onto the public sphere. BBC, that gives additional airtime to climate skeptics. It doesn't do it just because it's pressure, social pressure. Huge money is poured into this. Not only the religious group who have special interests, but also people who have a lot of money who do not want to see the rights established. They don't want they don't want actually to invest in prevention of deterioration of the climate. There are interests in there. They want to undermine it, and that's the challenge. I think it's good to say, right to say these are established facts, and we need to sort of stop giving, encouraging crazy people to come on the scene. But at the same time, we need to recognize at some stage we need to mobilize to challenge this.
I mean, part of it, a lot of it also has to do with, you know, the end of the Cold War, the end of universalism in a way, because that was a pretext for, you know, showing that there is universal values, and it was sort of, that's how the West often portrayed itself. And with multiculturalism, in a way, we've seen how universalism's been undermined, and culture and religions are given superior position vis-a-vis human beings. So that's why, in a sense, when they talk about we need to respect other people's opinions, the fact of the matter is we need to respect people. We don't necessarily have to respect all opinions. And I'm sorry, the opinion that a woman should be stoned to death isn't worthy of any respect whatsoever.
Yeah, but what are the interests that drives this onto the scene? Of course, for example, you'll see in the Middle East, to maintain and undermine the demand of people to have equal standards like everybody else stays established in the world, they need to impose the stoning, they need to impose harsh Islamic punishments and Sharia law. And to respect these ideas basically is to justify those conditions. There are people who benefit from these conditions. All the investments, all the Islamic banking, for example, is not just a fad. There are huge economic as well as political interests who benefit from Islamic banking, which it parallels on the undermining of the rights, and those undermining of the rights is bounced back into Europe. You'll see that the rights within Europe, from the wages and the standards, is being eroded, and these are all linked together.
Definitely.
So I think there's a link, and we need to recognise there is material interest there, and is a broader issue, and we need to challenge it head on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that we are living in a world where profit comes first, and in a sense we do see that so many things that have been gotten rid of because it's no longer profitable, there are a lot of things that are still made good use of, like religion, because it is very profitable, and it's a good way of making sure, keeping large segments of people down, dividing them, keeping them, with low wages and with limited education and information and access, as a way of control, in a sense.
And I think the good thing is that there is people who've recognised this as is an issue, and people are organising this at different levels. That the fact that scientists are standing, so look, actually, we don't want to speak to people who have no credential to question evolution. I mean, that's a form of resistance, and it actually shows the level of response and challenge to this. And I think we need to recognise there are a lot of people across, and they need to come together, and not only secularist movements, but people who oppose all this erosion of rights to come together and recognise internationally we have a role to play, we have an interest. The 21st century, as you mentioned, you have mentioned many times, demands and requires people to get together, be united, and challenge the erosion of rights and the undermining of the established facts.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's not just a question of the fact that not all beliefs are equal and equally valid. They also don't have moral equivalence, But you do often see that when this sort of religion and superstition is allowed to chip away at evidence and scientific progress and human progress, you do find that there is oftentimes an attempt to show moral equivalency when none exists. And they're actually at complete odds with each other. For example, you'll have people saying burning the ISIS flag is just as bad as what the Islamists do. No, it's not. ISIS slaughters people. Burning its flag is a symbolic form of opposition. There is no moral equivalency. In fact, it's one's moral duty to oppose ISIS, and in any way, shape and form that's possible.
Absolutely, and tear its flag, everybody. I think that's one of the things is catching on. In Middle East, in Europe, people have started to tear ISIS flag. Yeah, tear ISIS.
Yes, tear ISIS flag, not tear it.
Yeah,
tear
ISIS flag.
Tear its flag.
And to burn it, and burn it. I think that's a reasonable response that people
Definitely.
are. People who actually the blood is boiling, because
exactly
we're getting to a point. I'm really, really scared that people who start recognizing ISIS as something that we need to negotiate with, talk to, recognize all of those, and have no doubt there are people who think so.
Yeah.
There are powerful people who think so.
Well, we've reached the end of our discussion. Now, good thing Bahram's not here. How are we going to stop talking then now with three of us? But anyway, we've reached the end of our program. We'd like to hear what you think about these issues. They are important. And I'm sure you've come across a lot more examples than we've discussed. We're now going to go to the insane fatwa of the week. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. And this week's fatwa is by the Grand Ayatollah Nasser Shirazi from Iran. Just his title alone is enough to make one laugh. But his fatwa is that access to high-speed and third-generation internet is against Sharia and against moral and human standards. From my perspective, then everybody should have high-speed internet if it's against Sharia and against moral standards, their morality.
And I think it should be for free. I mean, that's the thing.
Definitely.
I think it's like
So
sort of
human rights.
I think it's basic needs these days. You can't actually function society without internet, and I think it should be free at the point of need for everybody. I think that's important. The reason that this funny guy thinks that because there is an interest for them to stop people communicating, Iran actually wants to build an intranet, just a system within Iran, so they can have absolute control over it. But you know, the generation and millions of young people have shown this is impossible. Satellite TV, they've tried and tried. They're on a losing battle, so we know.
Yes, we already know that 55% of the population in Iran have internet access, 70% have satellite TV. It's because they don't like Sharia and they don't like the morality of the Islamic regime, which is immoral in all senses. Do contact us and tell us what you think about the program. We hope you enjoyed this week's program and the interview that we had for you. Until next week, we hope you have a wonderful week. Goodbye.